What's up YouTube? This is part one of the longer series of a bunch of videos on the topic of Android Jetpack. And this beautiful suite of libraries contains a bunch of very interesting libraries, and we're going to start with the navigation component, which will allow you to navigate from one fragment to another, from one activity to another, and so forth in a very clean manner, as well as will allow you to pass data from one screen to another in a very efficient and clean way, also in a safe way using SafeArgs. So we're going to first set up our fragments, and we're going to move from one fragment to another. Then we're going to see how to pass data from one fragment to another using the traditional path and way. And then we're going to see how to use the same thing using the SafeArgs plugin. So we're going to send data from one fragment to another using SafeArgs. Okay, so you should know how to use fragments and should be aware of fragments before watching this video, and you should have a basic understanding of app development with Android and Kotlin in general before getting started with this. Okay, so let's get started with the video. All right, so let's get started looking at the navigation component. And navigation refers to the interactions that allow users to navigate across, into, and back out from the different pieces of content within your app. And the navigation component in Android Jetpack helps you to implement navigation from a single button click to more complex patterns, such as app bars and the navigation drawer. And well, basically the navigation component also ensures a consistent and predictable user experience by adhering to an established set of principles. So we're going to look at that in practice, of course, as well. We're going to build a little demo with the different navigation components that are going to be important for us. So it's basically a collection of libraries, a plugin, and tooling for unifying and simplifying Android navigation. So that's what this navigation component inside of this Android Jetpack library that is available to us. So what are the benefits of using it? Well, it's a simplified setup for common navigation patterns, which basically means it's easier to use and saves you a lot of hassle, especially when it comes to more complex navigation patterns. It handles the backstack, which means that if you go from one screen to another, it will know which screen you were at before. So if you move from screen A to screen B, may that be an activity or a fragment, if you click the back button, it will know to go from screen B to screen A. It automates fragment transactions, so moving from one fragment to another, and that is in general a very good structure to build your application with. So using fragments is really the way to go. It's of course a decision that you can make for yourself, but really fragments are something very powerful and useful, especially since basically Jetpack came about. It allows us to use type-safe argument passing, so basically passing arguments and data from one screen to another, and doing that in a type-safe way, which basically means that you don't have to handle all of the put extra details that you would usually do, putting that into an intent and then retrieving that on the other side. So it really is handled directly by the navigation component. And we're going to see how that happens and how it works. It handles transition animation, so if you're moving from one fragment to another, for example, and it simplified the deep linking functionality if you ever use that, and it also centralizes and visualizes navigation in general. So it really is basically a one-stop shop that helps you to use your navigation inside of your application. So here, the general principles of navigation are that you can move from one screen to another. So for example, from the home screen or launcher to the screen of your application, for example, the list screen where you can click on something and get the details. And when you click the back button, you can move back to the prior screen that you saw. And that is the backstack that is handled here. So basically knowing what is the screen in the stack that needs to be displayed next, if the user clicks back, for example. It has built-in support for activities as well as fragments, but it can also be extended to work with custom destinations such as your custom views. So if you create custom views for your application, it still works with it as well. The navigation component consists of the navigation graph, which is an XML resource that contains all navigation-related information in one centralized location. This includes all of the individual content areas within your app called destinations, as well as the possible paths that a user can take through your app. Then there's this navhost fragment, and navhost generally is an empty container that displays destinations from your navigation graph, and the navigation component contains a default navhost implementation. So the navhost fragment that displays the fragment destinations. Then you have the nav controller, which is an object that manages app navigation within a nav host. The nav controller orchestrates the swiping of destination content in the nav host as users move throughout your app. So these are very powerful words, right? It's going to make a lot more sense once we get into the actual demo and see how this works in practice, because basically these are just words and we need to experience what these words do for us. Okay, so then there is also the SafeArgs Plugin, which generates classes based on your navigation graph to ensure type-safe access to arguments for destinations and actions, which basically means that you can define that you want to be able to move from one screen to another, and then you can add arguments to that move, which then allows you to basically pass details from one screen to another. And the cool thing is, it is generating classes for you automatically based on your navigation graph. So it's really a type-safe way. It's in general a very good practice to use it. So the navigation UI has additional library and KTX extension support for options menu, bottom navigation, navigation view, navigation drawer, action bar, toolbar, collapsing toolbar. So basically all types of navigation that you have in your application, you can use it there. So I'd say this is enough of a presentation. I think it really makes sense to get into practice and see how all of that works, to build this up with 3 different examples that we're going to build, and you're going to see how to use navigation and how powerful it is. And of course, we're going to use it in our bigger projects later on as well. All right, see you in the next one. Quick pause. This video is sponsored by our Jetpack Masterclass course, which we've been working on for a couple of months, and this video is basically just part of that course. And if you want to learn everything about Jetpack that is relevant for your future applications, definitely check out the link in the description below. We have created a great course which teaches you to basically use all of the relevant Jetpack components, as well as build a real life application, which you can see here. So in the background, you can see the components. We're going to implement most of them in our application here, so you're going to learn how to build those, but we also have separate demos which teach you the components separately as well. So definitely check out the course. In the course you will build this little dishes application where you can store your favorite dishes using the room database. You can delete those dishes or edit them. You can create your own dishes with your own images or the gallery if you have any dishes there, and then store it using the room database. And at the same time, use an API to get data from the internet. So here you can load a random dish, which you then can add to your favorite list, and then basically see it in all your dishes and as well as in your favorite. Thanks for watching the video. Check out the link in the description for the full course. What we're going to build next is going to be this application that you can see here. The only thing that it will do is it will allow the user to enter some data and then verify the details and then basically populate them in another fragment. So we're going to use fragments here instead of activities, basically moving from one fragment to another using the navigation component of Jetpack. And that is really the whole idea about this. We're going to use SafeArgs as well as actions in order to move from one fragment to another. All right, so let's get started by building a little demo. I'm going to use an empty activity for this, and I'm going to call this one nav demo. I'm going to use Kotlin as well as API 21. And then once my project is loaded, I will move over to the build.gradle file. And I need to make sure that I'm adding a couple of dependencies here. Okay, so the dependencies that I'm going to add are going to be the ones that we need for navigation as well as legacy support. Okay, so we have navigation fragment, KTX, as well as navigation UI, KTX, and then finally the legacy support v4. This allows us to basically have support for all the versions of Android. And then here we need to sync it. So click sync now. And now you can use all of those tools in your application. So far we have only the main activity here, and the next thing that I will want to have is a couple of fragments. So I don't want to use activities in this case. I really want to work with fragments. Of course, we're going to need an activity that can host a fragment, because fragments can only be part of an activity. They always need the activity context, so to speak. But other than that, we can have multiple fragments running on one activity. And that's what we're going to do here. All right, so the first thing that we're going to add is new fragment here. So let me create a new fragment. Here I'm going to use a blank fragment, okay, which will basically be an empty fragment. I'm going to call this one enter details fragment. And you will see that it automatically gives you a couple of arguments, and I'm going to get rid of those. I'm not going to need them. And I'm going to clean up my application in general, because I'm really not using any of those arguments. As well as this companion object, we're not going to use that either. So let me get rid of that. So now we have a very clean fragment, which basically has an onCreate method as well as an onCreateView method. These are lifecycle methods which will be called straight away when the application is getting to that details fragment. So then the onCreate method will be called, and then the onCreateView method that will then create the view by inflating our fragment layout. So if you look at that, that is basically our fragment layout, which currently just has a text view and nothing else. So in this fragment, we have the frame layout. So it contains a frame layout in which just has this text view here saying hello blank fragment. So nothing too fancy, super simple UI. So next I'm going to design a layout, and the thing is, I'm not gonna go over the details of how to design a layout. This is something that I expect you to know how to do. So I'm just going to replace this code with the layout that I'm going to use and quickly show you what's going on here. So basically this is the layout that I will have. Enter your details below with a name and mobile number and this little button, which basically will be inside of a linear layout. So I'm not using a constraint layout, which would be a great option if you want to design it by using drag and drop. But in this case, because I only have elements on top of each other, it's a lot easier to just use a linear layout. So I'm using a text view here, as well as a text input layout, which is this edit text twice. Okay, so we have two of them. One of them is going to be the name, the other one is the mobile number, and then finally we have a button at the very bottom, which is going to be the button verify details. Okay, so this is the UI that we get from that, and that's basically the UI that you saw in the application. All right, now at this point, let's create another fragment, and I'm going to create it here, another fragment called verify details fragment, and I misspelled it there. It should be verify. Let me refactor it real quick. So this should be verify details fragment. Now let's get rid of all of the boilerplate code that we don't need. We're not going to use those arguments that are given to us this way. We're going to build everything from scratch, except for, of course, the onCreate and onCreateView method, because we're going to need those as they are. Okay, next I need to make sure that I take care of the navigation. So if you look at it, we have resources here, which are our drawables, layouts, mipmaps, and so forth. But now we also need to have one for navigation. So let's go ahead and create a new directory here called navigation. And inside of this directory, I'm going to create a new navigation file. Okay, so here you can see now at the top, it directly says navigation resource file, because the folder has a name that fits to it. So we created this folder, which is a keyword that exists in the context of our application, which is why it directly understands that if I create an XML file here, I'm going to most likely want to create a navigation resource file, which is of course the XML file that it can work with. So I'm just going to call it navigation, and really you could of course give all of these elements better names. You could of course create an extra directory here underneath nav demo for UI elements to clean things up and everything. That's what we're going to do in the bigger project, but for this demo, it's really not necessary. But what you will see here is you will have a little design, and you can click this icon here at the top to add a destination. You can also see that we have a navigation code in XML here, which is basically empty. The only thing that it has is an ID and a namespace that it uses. But now we can use this little button here and then select which of our fragments or activities should be the destination. Okay, so for example, I can select here my enter details fragment as the destination. Now you can add another one. I'm going to add the verify details, and of course the name was still incorrect there. And the cool thing is I can now go ahead and just drag this little part here over to this other fragment. What will happen in code is this action will be added. So let me get this back, and now I'm going to only have those two fragments for now, right? As you see that the XML code created two fragments in here. So one fragment is named enter details fragment with a name and the label as well as a layout that is defined for it. And then we have this fragment here, which is the verify details fragment. Now, if you want to create an action, you can do it directly inside of this fragment in XML code, or you can really just drag this little part to the fragment that you want to have a navigation to. So now I can navigate from this screen to this other screen, which is basically going to be this fragment to this other fragment. And what is created for me is this new action. So you see, this action now is inside of the fragment. Okay, so here this is the fragment opening tag and this is the closing tag. So this action is associated to that fragment. And this action has an ID, which is a pretty long name. It says action enter details fragment 2, verify details fragment 2. And it has the destination of verify details fragment, which is this fragment right here, right? So it's going to move over to that fragment. So you could easily create this action manually yourself. You would just need to give it an ID as well as a destination and then say where it starts. So it's going to start in that fragment. So that's where you would put that action in. What you will also realize is that here the start destination is our enter details fragment. This will be the first screen that will be displayed when this navigation is going to be used. Okay, now this by itself will not be enough. We need to go to our activity main, which is our entry point into the application. Because if you look at your Android manifest, you will find that here it says intent action main. And this basically means that this will be the activity that will be displayed first. Okay, so it's the launcher activity. You have a category here. So basically it will make sure that this activity is the first one to be displayed inside of your application. Now we can go to our activity main XML and make some changes here, because what we have here is only the text view, right? And instead of having this text view, which I'm not going to display at all, I will just set up the fragment that I want to use here. And I'm going to give it a width of 0 density pixels as well as a height of 0 density pixels. And that will basically do the trick, right? But of course you need to add a couple more settings because we're in a constrained layout. So let's go over to this designer, and unfortunately it doesn't help me here. So I need to give this fragment an ID, and I'm going to call this fragment. Then we need to give it a name, and I'm going to say that this is going to be my nav host fragment. Okay, so Android X navigation fragment nav host fragment. So navigation host, so to speak. And I'm going to set this as the default nav host. So this is going to be our navigation host, our default navigation host. Then you need to add the constraints because, well, we're in a constrained layout after all, right? So let's add those here as well. I'm just going to say that it's going to have constraints towards the parent in all directions. So towards the top, towards the bottom, and so forth. So basically it's going to take the whole space that is available in the screen. And then that's going to be the most important part here, is going to be that we assign a nav graph. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying that the nav graph for this fragment should be the navigation. So at navigation is the navigation folder, and then the navigation name keyword is going to be this navigation XML file that we created. So now we defined in the main activity XML file that our navigation that we have created, this navigation XML file, is going to take care of how the navigation will be handled inside of our application. Because basically we are hosting a fragment inside of our main activity, and that fragment hosts a navigation graph. Okay, so this basically means that we're now going to use the navigation graph that we just saw, which is this beautiful little graph here. So this whole file is the navigation graph, so to speak. So this by itself will, however, not be enough. We also need to add something in the main activity onCreate method, and that will be our nav controller. So we need to make sure that we're using navigation, which is a class that was created for us based on our dependencies that we added earlier. And now we can find a navigation controller. We need to pass an activity, which is going to be this, because we're inside of the main activity, and that is also where we're going to need the navigation controller. And then I'm going to use the fragment, because the fragment, if we look at it, is this fragment here, right? I just gave it this very basic name, but it contains the nav graph, and it is the default nav host. So this means that it will now be our navigation controller, or it holds our navigation controller, right? This fragment holds the nav controller that we're going to use in our application. And now we just need to set up the navigation UI to also have an action bar with nav controller in our application. So I'm just going to pass this and the nav controller. That was basically the idea here. So we're using the navigation UI, which is a class which hooks up elements typically in the Chrome of your application, such as global navigation patterns like a navigation drawer or bottom nav bar. So we're not using a bottom nav bar, and I'm doing that on purpose because using a navigation bar would set up everything for us already. We wouldn't have to do any of the stuff that we just do here. But the idea behind this video is really to explain you how this is built from scratch and how this whole interaction between a navigation as well as fragments and the main activity or activities in general is. Okay, so at this point our main activity will fully host the fragment that we created. And now it's time to actually define a couple of buttons that we can click, or basically define the UI that it does anything. So go to the enter details fragment here, and what I'm going to need is in my onCreate view, I'm going to need to set up a couple of things. Okay, so the first thing will be to have my root view to be the inflator, basically what we have here. So this part here. I'm not going to return it straight away. I'm going to add a couple of changes to that root view. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to have a button, verify details, which should use the root view and get the ID item from it, which is going to be a button. Okay, so you could of course use view binding here, but I'm going to keep it simple in this example, and that's why I'm going to use find view by ID. Okay, so that's how you can find a view by ID inside of a fragment. Okay, and then the next thing that we're going to set is an onClick listener for this button. Set onClick listener, and now we can say what we want to execute once the user clicks on the button. Okay, and let me return the root view so that the error disappears and it's not complaining anymore. So at this point, we can go ahead and use find nav controller in order to navigate. And here we're going to use our action enter details fragment to so-and-so, super long name, enter details fragment to verify details fragment. What that will do is, if you look at it, it will execute this action here. If we look at it, it's this action here, which has the destination to go to the verify details fragment. So we're starting in this enter details fragment and we're moving over to the verify details fragment. So basically going from this screen to this screen. That's what we're doing here, right? All right, and at this point, we should have everything to test our application. And you saw it wasn't too much code. It was more about me talking a lot and explaining everything that I did there and saw there. So you can see this is our fragment enter details fragment, so to speak. And now I click on this and you see we're moving over to this other fragment. Now this button here at the top doesn't do anything because we didn't implement that yet, but the back button works already. And you see we never had to implement anywhere that we're using the back button or use the on back pressed default functionality or anything like that. That was all handled automatically by the navigation component for us. So yeah, the next interesting thing that we are going to look at is, of course, how to pass data from here to the other fragment, because these are two different screens. But the cool thing is they're still in the same activity. And this is a very efficient way of working with your UI. This is super, super fast. Okay, so that's it for now. Let's have a quick break and see you in the next part. Quick pause. This video is sponsored by our Jetpack Masterclass course, which we've been working on for a couple of months, and this video is basically just part of that course. And if you want to learn everything about Jetpack that is relevant for your future applications, definitely check out the link in the description below. We have created a great course which teaches you to basically use all of the relevant Jetpack components as well as build a real life application, which you can see here. So in the background, you can see the components. We're going to implement most of them in our application here. So you're going to learn how to build those, but we also have separate demos which teach you the components separately as well. So definitely check out the course. In the course, you will build this little dishes application where you can store your favorite dishes using the room database. You can delete those dishes or edit them. You can create your own dishes with your own images or the gallery if you have any dishes there, and then store it using the room database. And at the same time, use an API to get data from the internet. So here you can load a random dish, which you then can add to your favorite list and then basically see it in all your dishes and as well as in your favorite. Thanks for watching the video. Check out the link in the description for the full course. All right, welcome back. In this video, we're going to implement the functionality to also be able to go back using this button here at the top because, well, it doesn't work so far. And we're going to pass the data from this fragment to the other fragment. Okay, we're not going to display it yet, but for now, we're just going to take care of passing it using the navigation args. Okay, so let's first of all take care of this back button, and therefore I'm going to go to the main activity, and I'm going to make sure that the nav controller is going to be a global variable that I can use throughout this class. So I'm going to call this nav controller. That's fine. It's going to be of type nav controller. And at this point, we need to take care of initializing it. So get rid of this val so you don't create a new variable for this. And then there is a method that you can override, and it's called onSupport navigate up. What this will allow us to do is to now not only return this super support on navigation up, but instead take care of the functionality so that we can click on the back button by saying navigation UI dot navigate up should use the nav controller that we have set up. And then you need to give it another setting here, which is the openable layout. And I'm going to set that to no. Okay, so I have a couple of brackets, too many here, but now this should do the trick. Now let's run this and see if the back button is going to work. So let's verify details, and you see now this back button here at the top is also going to work for us. And this was enabled by this line here. So this set up the action bar with navigation controller, which basically means this back button. And here we enabled its functionality so that it actually goes back up in the stack, basically going to the activity that was opened before, or in this particular case, even the fragment that was displayed before. So we don't even need to double check if we're in a fragment or in an activity. That's all taken care of by the navigation component of Jetpack. Okay, now let's go over to our enter details fragment, and let's add all of the different elements that we want to work with. For example, I want to work with the edit text name as well as the mobile number. And now let me check if I had an error here. ID ET first name, well, that was the internal name that I had there. So let's look at what this is. Well, it's basically those two edit texts. Okay, so now I want to access those two edit texts to then use the data inside of my application and pass it. Okay, so this is what we're doing here. We're finding it by ID. You can see we're using the root view once again, which is basically our fragment enter details. This is basically how we can get the views from a fragment, as we have seen earlier with this button here, where we also got the button using the fragment find view by ID on the root view. Okay, now we need to make a couple of changes inside of the on-click listener if we want to double check those. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to get the first name and the mobile number by getting the text from the edit text and convert it into a string. And the same goes for the mobile number. So whatever the user has entered will be converted into a string here as well. And then we will validate if the values that the user has entered are empty or not. Okay, so I'm just going to check if they're empty. I'm just going to make a little toast. So if the first name entry is empty, which means that this field here, if that field is empty and we clicked on verify details, then a toast should appear saying enter name. And if the mobile number is empty, it should say something like enter mobile number. Okay, so nothing too complicated here. But what's interesting is the else case. So here else, which means if those two are not empty, at that point I want to move over to the other fragment, to this fragment here, to the verify details fragment, and I want to pass the data to that other fragment. And in order to do that, I'm going to create a bundle, which will be a bundle of var args. So here I can create a var arg pair or multiple var arg pairs, and a pair is a string and an any object. So in our case, I'm just going to use name is going to be assigned to first name, and here I have to write it correctly, and mobile is going to be assigned to mobile dot to long. Okay, so whatever the user has entered, that will be a long value. We need to make sure that this is going to work there as well. And of course we need to get rid of this comma here because that's one too many. Okay, so we prepared the bundle now, the bundle of arguments that we want to send over to this other fragment. And now at this point we can go over to the other fragment. But before we do that, we of course need to make sure that we pass the information here as well. So this navigate method has multiple overrides. Okay, so there's one option where we navigate with a res ID, and then another one where we have the res ID plus a bundle of args or even nav options. So there are multiple overloads, I believe is the right term here. And we're going to use the overload where we now pass the bundle also. So here I'm going to pass the bundle of args. Okay, so that's how you, and actually maybe it's better if I put this comma here, then it's a little more readable, I guess. So now we're going to navigate over and we're going to pass this information to the other fragment. So now that we pass it, how do we retrieve it? Well, in the verify details fragment, we're going to retrieve them on create view. So once the view is created, we will have access to them. So I'm going to create a new variable, which I'm going to call name inside of onCreateView. And then I'm going to check the arguments, which is a nullable, so it can be empty, for a string called name. And then I'm going to do the same with the mobile number, which will be arguments and get along with the mobile number. And of course, arguments needs to be spelled correctly. Now, if you want to display it in the UI straight away, you will need to make sure that you go to the fragment verify details XML file and change it up a little bit. So I'm just going to use a linear layout here once again to display all of the information. So let me replace this real quick and show you how this is going to look like. So basically I have this text view here at the top saying verify your entered details below, then the name as well as the name displayed. So we have a label as well as the actual name that the user has entered, a label for the mobile number as well as the number that the user has entered. Okay, so these are going to be the text views that I'm going to use here. It's basically just 4 text views that I have, actually 5 text views that I have here. One for the title, so to speak, then one for the label of the name, the actual name entry, which will also require, of course, an ID so that we can access it. And the same goes for the mobile number. It also requires an ID so we can access it. And we're using different colors here. So this is really something that is up to you. You can set it up however you want. The UI, the only things that are going to be important are going to be the 2 with the ID where you want to display the data. The others are just there for better visibility, so to speak. And now at this point, we can use those. So let's go over here and use those values that we have here and pass them to our edit text, or basically set them as the text value for our edit text. And that's something that I would like you to pause the video and try to do yourself, because, well, you should be able to do that. Just a little hint. Use the root view as we have done in the enter details fragment. So here we also use this root view. So we are going to require something similar to what you see here. Okay, so I hope you paused the video and tried it real quick. So of course we're going to need a root view, which we get by using the inflator, inflating the fragment. And here I had misspelled it, of course. So let me refactor it real quick, and it should be verify details, not verify, like this. And then we can access the text view for the name as well as for the mobile number. Okay, so I'm just going to access those 2 here. Now you can see we can use those and now set the values of, for example, our name to be the text of our name argument that was passed to us. And now we're going to do the same thing with the mobile number, but we have to take into consideration that this mobile number object here, or this variable, is of type long. So we need to convert it into a string at this point. And now instead of returning the inflator, we can just return our root view that we had set up here. So at this point, let's test the application and see whether we're going to be able to pass the details from one screen to another. Okay, so I'm going to enter Dennis here and the mobile number. Let's verify the details, and we see the details were passed to the other fragment. And now instead, let's not enter anything here and verify details, and you see enter name is displayed, as well as, well, if I enter a name and click here, you see enter mobile number is displayed. So those little toasts that we had set up are working correctly. All right, so that's the second part of this project. Now we just need to run the third part, in which we will see how to do all of that with this argument stuff in a safer way. We're going to use SafeArgs instead, because now you know how to do it, let's say, in a classical way, but we're not using SafeArgs, which is another bundle that we can use, which is super powerful and useful. So instead of using this, I'd say, antiqued approach, we're going to use a super cool Jetpack-ish approach, and that will be to use SafeArgs. So let's have another break here and see you in the next part. Quick pause. This video is sponsored by our Jetpack Masterclass course, which we've been working on for a couple of months, and this video is basically just part of that course. And if you want to learn everything about Jetpack that is relevant for your future applications, definitely check out the link in the description below. We have created a great course which teaches you to basically use all of the relevant Jetpack components, as well as build a real life application, which you can see here. So in the background, you can see the components. We're going to implement most of them in our application here. So you're going to learn how to build those, but we also have separate demos which teach you the components separately as well. So definitely check out the course. In the course, you will build this little dishes application where you can store your favorite dishes using the room database. You can delete those dishes or edit them. You can create your own dishes with your own images or the gallery if you have any dishes there, and then store it using the room database. And at the same time, use an API to get data from the internet. So here you can load a random dish, which you then can add to your favorite list, and then basically see it in all your dishes and as well as in your favorite. Thanks for watching the video. Check out the link in the description for the full course. Okay, so now that we have seen how to do it in a classical approach, let's look at how we can use SafeArgs instead. And SafeArgs are going to help us to pass arguments in a safe manner, because you see here we had to check the type, and then we needed to enter a key, which is a string. So a lot of things could go wrong when doing that. You could have misspelled it or whatever. It's really a pain in the butt sometimes if you use this approach. So instead, we're going to go over to our build.gradle once again. And here we need to add another dependency, and this will be in, I believe, the other build Gradle. So in the one that is not the app build Gradle, here in dependencies, I will need to add a couple of lines, which is this nav version, as well as this here where I'm using the class path Android navigation SafeArgs Gradle plugin with the nav version, which is in my case 232, or maybe it's 233 already at this point. It really depends on when you record this, but 232 should work either way. So now you can sync it. And once it is synced, we need to go to our build.gradle app. And here we also need to make sure that we have this plugin installed, which means this Android X Navigation SafeArgs Kotlin plugin. So let's sync that as well. This will install the plugin for us. Now we can use it throughout our application. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my navigation XML file. And here I'm going to make a couple of changes. So the first thing is that in my verify details fragment, I want to have arguments now, which means that I need to make sure that I can add elements into the fragment. And how I do that is I just open with a arrow key and then the argument. Okay, and here this argument needs to have a couple of parameters, mainly the name. So I'm going to call this name, then the arg type, which will be in my case string, and then the default value if you want to define that. So I'm just going to use a default value of an empty string. And if I do that, I need to do it like so. Okay, so in apostrophes, I can add that. Okay, so let me add that separately. So this is argument number 1, and I'm going to create another argument, which will be the mobile number, and the arg type will be a long, and the default value in this case will be 0L, capital L, L standing for long, so that it doesn't think that this will be an integer, because if you just enter a number, then it will think that this is an integer. If you want to specify that this is a long, then add the letter L here. And now we can go ahead and make a change to our enter details fragment, where we use the bundle in order to pass the data. So instead of using this bundle with all of the different parameters, in this case we just had 2, but you see we had a string here, highly risky, as well as here as well. So now instead of that, we can just get rid of this, and instead using our enter details fragment directions, and this will only be available once you build your application. So let me do that real quick. You will also need to do that, rebuild, because otherwise the will not. because this will now generate a file for us, an auto-generated file after a couple of seconds once the Gradle is done. And of course you shouldn't have errors in here. So let me get rid of this nav controller entirely and then rebuild the project. Because if you have errors, then it will think, well, I'm not gonna even try to generate something for you. So you see now I have a new folder here that I didn't have there before. And it's, to be precise, this folder here, which is enter details fragment directions, as well as verify details fragment args. The cool thing is these are two auto-generated classes that will now help us to safely navigate from one screen to another. So here, the details fragment directions, you see, they have a name of type string and a mobile of type long with the default value of L, and this here with the default value of an empty string. And then we have the action ID that will execute it, which is this R action enter details fragment to verify details fragment, which is this arrow here, this blue arrow. That's the action of moving from one screen to another. So now it created this file for us, as well as the args as well. So now it auto-generated this bundle for us, and there's even a companion object. So it's quite a cool stuff, so that it automatically generated for us, and we can now use that in our project. So let's get back to our enter details fragment, where we can now just use find nav controller and navigate to our enter details fragment, or using our enter details fragment actions with the name that we have defined for it, which was a super long name. And then we can now pass the arguments that we want to pass. And this is a very long name, so I'm going to put that in the next line as well as here. And the two variables that I will pass will be name as well as the mobile to long. So now we just need to make sure that we have those names exactly like that. So I called it first name at the top, so I'm going to use that as well. So you see that now we can pass variables directly instead of creating an extra bundle and all of that. So it's safe arguments that we're using here. And then in the verify details fragment, we can now use SafeArgs here instead. So let me comment this out. And instead get the args first, which will be verify details fragment args by nav args. And this is the type of args that I'm going to use. And for this to work, you need to import nav args. So let's import that. This will then import nav args here at the top, fragment nav args. And now we can create the two variables. So val name will be args.name and val mobile will be args.mobile. And that already does the trick, and I called it mobile number. So let me call that mobile number here as well. Okay, and that's going to be basically it. So that's going to do the trick for us as well. Now we are passing the data using SafeArgs instead of this bundled approach that we created earlier. So let me go ahead and use an entry here. So let's verify the details, and you see it works exactly as it did before, but now we're using SafeArgs. So the main advantages here are that it's simpler to use. These SafeArgs are simpler to use than using the bundle, and at the same time you're passing type safe data. So you're passing it between the destinations. This allows you to take advantage of data encapsulation by passing only the data that you need between destinations instead of exposing it more broadly. So even the documentation says SafeArgs is strongly recommended for navigating and passing data because it ensures type safety. Okay, while in terms of code, it might not have been quicker, so we didn't have to write less code, but at the same time, we made our application a lot safer and we're using best practices here. Okay, so that's it for this video. you saw how to use navigation, how to use the navigation component, how to use the navigation graph, how to create actions to move from one fragment to another fragment. And there are even developers who say that you should build an application only using fragments, not even using extra activities except for your main activity in your application. So this is really something that you might take into consideration. You saw how all of that is connected in terms of your code, what's happening, how you can write an action manually, how those fragments are connected to each other, what a destination is in terms of an action, what the start destination is, basically being the entry point of your fragments or of your navigation in general, how to pass arguments using SafeArgs in order to pass data from one fragment to another in a type-safe manner without exposing any other information that is not to be exposed. And yeah, that's basically it for this video. Thanks a lot for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Definitely hit the like button if you liked it, as well as hit that subscribe button at the notification bell to never miss out on any of our other videos. We're uploading regularly and we're uploading high quality content, as you saw in this video. And also check out the link in the description below in order to get the full course and another video of the YouTube channel if you like it. All right, that's it for me. Have a nice day.